Hello, everyone, and welcome, a very warm welcome to day two of International Leadership Week 2021. My name is John Mark Williams. I'm the Chief Executive at the Institute of Leadership and Management, and I'm delighted to be your host for this LinkedIn Live session today. And I'd like to thank our sponsors also for this year's International Leadership Week, Belbin and Heriot-Watt University's Edinburgh Business School. Now, it's not every day that we get to hear directly from one of the legends of leadership and management, and certainly my guest today deserves that accolade. One of the foremost management thinkers of our generation, Henry Mintzberg stands out both for the intellectual quality of his ideas and their unique relevance to real life management experience. For decades now, he's been consistently a thought leader in business, and almost every executive bookshelf will contain one of his many books, about 20 books on management and leadership. It is my great privilege and pleasure to be joined by Professor Henry Mintzberg. Henry, welcome, sir.
Thank you, John. It's delightful to be here.
It's great to see you. And Henry, can we start by you giving us your current thoughts on leadership?
Well, my current thoughts aren't current as far as I'm concerned, nor are they current for most of the literature or most of the discussion
Mhm.
about leadership. I'm kind of a little wary about leadership because it tends to focus on individuals. Even when the individual is empowering or doing all those good things, the focus is on individuals. Even when we talk about everybody being a leader, Einstein was a leader, even though he didn't necessarily have a position of authority. It's still individualistic. So the word I like is communityship. I think leadership and communityship have to go together. I think good leadership encourages communityship, and communityship requires leadership to enhance it, to support it, to maintain it.
And the theme of, in fact, this International Leadership Week is leadership reinvented. Now, I know that you've spent a lot of your career talking about management, and there's a lot of I would call it flow in people's minds between those two terms, leadership and management. Is there do you think there's a point in talking about management reinvented, or is it something else?
Management desperately needs to be reinvented or at least rediscovered.
Ah, okay.
I'm not sure it needs to be reinvented. I'm not sure we need some new form of management. Management's not a profession, and it's not a science. It's a practice. So I don't think you reinvent practice. You improve it constantly. My concern is that we've had a kind of a disconnect in too much management, where people are leaders but they're not managers. Leaders who don't manage don't know what's going on. Managers who don't lead are boring, but leaders who don't manage don't know what's going on. So they're two sides of the same coin, and I think we've lost. We get too much remote control management, where people are disconnected and deem. I call it management by deeming. They deem that things should happen without knowing what the consequences are on the ground. Uh, Good management, good leadership means connection, attachment. And that's not micromanaging. Micromanaging is when you interfere, but being there and seeing what's going on. And if you're running a retail chain, walking in your stores, if you're if you're a coach of a football team, being on the ground, which of course every coach of football or soccer teams are on the ground. You can't imagine otherwise. But that's maybe they're the model of what's going on. You've got to pick up the pulse of what's happening on the ground.
That's very interesting because one of the, I suppose, one of the challenges of leadership has been this rise up the ladder of responsibility towards strategy. Leadership is associated with doing strategic stuff, and strategy very often seems to imply let's write a strategy that might be 30 or 40 pages and then it'll last us for the next 10 years and off we go. You've been a strong advocate of emergent strategy. Do you see that as being useful in the current climate, for example?
I think even more than before. The more the uncertainty, the more emergent strategy is important. So I contrast deliberate strategy with emergent strategy. And deliberate strategy means you know exactly what you're trying to do and you just go out and do it. But that's not how you get strategies. I maintain that strategic planning is an oxymoron. Nobody in the history of the earth ever made a strategy through a planning process or through analytic techniques, because strategy is about synthesis. And it's not about analysis, and it's not about planning, it's about learning. To get to a strategy is learning. Of course, having the strategy means that it's deliberate. But how did you get there? And my favorite example is IKEA, because IKEA has this brilliant strategy, which is clearly deliberate today, which is in large part selling unassembled furniture. So you can take it home in your car and you can save money, and they can save money by you assembling it and so on.
Yeah.
So it's a brilliant strategy. Well, you read their own website, and that didn't come from a planning process or an executive committee or even a chief executive. It came from a worker trying to put a table in his car, and it didn't fit, so he took the legs off. And then came the strategic moment, which is, hey, wait a minute, if we have to take the legs off, so do they. So there were two critical aspects to that strategy. Number one, that little switch of, hey, wait a minute, if we have to do it, they have to do it. And the other is the organization had a culture where that, coming from a worker in with a car, ended up getting to the senior people who could do something with it. And then, of course, it became a deliberate strategy. So now it's a deliberate strategy.
That's really interesting, because that's a culture of learning by doing, almost learning by replicating what the customer actually has to go through.
Yeah,
do you think
not almost.
Yeah, but actually, in fact, yes, in total terms, yeah.
Yeah, you learn your strategy step by step. You try something, it works, do more of it. It doesn't work, do something else, and little by little, you make your way to there. It took 15 years for IKEA to get to fully realize the consequence, fully develop the consequence of that little insight.
That's really interesting, because that's classic emergent strategy, I guess. And is there a way for organizations to do that deliberately, almost like a deliberate emergent strategy, if you like, engaging with the customer and iterating the strategy for the organization over time?
Well, you have to, yeah, I think another way to put it is you need to be conscious about that process and what you're doing. If you elaborate it too much and you sort of make too much out of it, I think then you kind of lose it in a way. So you've got to be conscious, because if you're not conscious of it, then what you're conscious of is what 90% of the literature tells you, which is deliberate strategy, strategic planning, think and then do, rather than do and then think.
There's an element of organizational mindfulness about that sort of self-awareness within the organization. Are we?
Yeah. By the way,
let
me just say, John, it's a self-awareness, almost more so, of what not to do. It's a self-awareness that strategic planning is useless. And I'm not trying to be outrageous. Strategic planning as a formalized process is useless. It turns out to be strategic programming. It doesn't create strategy. It elaborates the consequences of a strategy. So that's fine, but don't call it strategic planning, call it operational planning.
Okay. No, that's excellent, and it has that iterative, emergent feel to it, which actually is natural human behavior, I guess. We think about what do we do next, rather than what should we be doing over the next 5 years. One of the challenges of this,
you can also, you can also think about what you should be doing over the next 5 years, but you should be realizing that you've got to learn your way into that, and you've got to see, you do have to see the long-term consequences of this little sort of idea of taking the legs off the table. That had long-term consequences, especially when they picked it up and said, "Oh my goodness, we need to make unassembled furniture." That had long-term consequences. So
but
it's the idea. Yeah, it's the idea of step-by-step learning, that you.
That's a I'll use this word challenge again, I guess, really, in the current context, because management has increasingly become leadership. As I mentioned earlier on, this idea of, well, management is what our people do, leadership is what we do at the top of the organization. Is there an inherent damage to the organization in that kind of kudos, I guess, self-appointed kudos at the leadership level?
Well, let me give an example of self-appointed. We have an EMBA program that we do jointly with Ashley Say, the French Business School in Montreal, and one year with the new class coming in, one of the rah-rah marketing guys kind of was addressing the class, and he said, "Who's a leader?" And about 5 hands went up, and I thought, "You're not leaders. Leaders don't designate themselves. Leaders don't appoint themselves. Leaders are selected by people who choose to follow them,
Ah,
and so this kind of self thing. I'm a leader is so there's just too much hype. On the other hand, I find myself using the word leadership in all kinds of ways, particularly politically, and saying, we try and solve our problems like climate change through leadership, but where's the leadership? We hype so much about leadership, and yet who's taking the lead? Who's got the guts to do what we have to do? I'm doing a piece called "Climate Change is Not the Problem," because it's the consequence of the problem, and the problem is a kind of imbalance in society. We won't get into that, but it is an imbalance, and who's trying to rebalance? Who's trying to address that? Where's the intellectual and the political leadership? We have. We're getting off track a bit, but maybe not completely. We have 4-year governments making 40-year plans, or 50 or 30 or whatever.
right.
That's
Right.
laughable. It's absolutely laughable. You make a plan, Obama makes a plan, and then Trump throws it in the garbage, and then Biden comes in and makes a plan, and who knows who will throw it in the garbage
Yep.
next. We won't get anywhere with climate change through planning. We will get somewhere if we start acting and take actions right away. But that we've had 26 cop-outs.
Yeah, so far.
So far.
Yeah. So is this a case for leadership as behavior rather than leadership as language or mindset or any of that sort of stuff? It's what we do that defines whether or not leadership is actually in place.
Yeah, it's about leadership as also behavior, because what a head of state does in pronouncements is obviously very consequential. If Biden says A or B or C, that could be very consequential. But it is behavior, not only saying it, but what are you doing about it?
So you mentioned it earlier on, this idea of leaders needing to be managers, managers also needing to be leaders. I know that you've been heavily engaged in coaching as a way for people to actually express this ability to be both managers and leaders. Could you tell us a little bit about coaching ourselves?
Yeah, it started, it's a different kind of coaching. It's not the expert coach coming in and sitting, beside the chief executive and giving advice. It's not that kind of coaching. It goes back, I'll tell you a bit the story. I used to go around giving speeches in business schools, talking down the MBA program, saying that they train the wrong people in the wrong ways with the wrong consequences. But other than that, I have no problem with them. And because you can't create a manager in a classroom. You can teach marketing and finance and accounting quite well, and business schools do that well, but you can't create a manager in a classroom. So people started to say, okay, so what are you doing about it? And I said, I'm an academic. I'm not supposed to do anything. I'm just supposed to criticize. Anyway, we created a program called the IMPM, the International Masters Program for Managers, and we kind of broke all the rules in a way. We sit people at round tables. We don't put them in a tiered classroom. We don't use cases. barely. We spent half the time it's over to them on their agenda. The people come to the class are managers, typically around 40, but anywhere from 30 to 70.
Yep.
And we've had 70-year-olds in the class,
Uh-huh.
or late 60s, and they reflect on their experience and share it with each other. And half the time they do that, and half the time we make inputs. So Phil Lanier, a good friend who was working as head of engineering for a speech recognition company, said, "Henry, I'm having difficulty. My managers need some training. I have no help from HR." And I said, "Well, why don't you do what we do in our classes, Phil?" So he started to do it. He just brought his managers together, and they did what we do, with the sharing and reflecting on experience. And it worked so well that those managers started to do it. It was a kind of like an Amway
Yep.
thing. And eventually he quit his job and created, in partnership with me too, coachingourselves.com, where we do much the same thing, except the academic or the conceptual material is introduced online. So you have a topic like emergent strategy or leadership or whatever it is. We have lots of those, and people download them and work on them in their groups and relate. What if we talk about emergent strategy? The first part of the topic would be what we talked about, what it is and how it works. The second part would be, okay, how can you do it? Do you have experiences of that in your own group? Because usually these are intact company teams. How can you use it, and so on and so forth, and it works very well. So it's a kind of coaching ourselves.
So is that that idea of cascading the coaching, as you mentioned, the managers learn how to do it and then they cascade it themselves. Is that something, do you think, that organically can spread in organizations? Because if it does, it sounds like it could be very positive for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, I think it could be revolutionary. I mean, it's mentoring, basically, isn't it? It can spread through mentoring, or it can spread through peer relationships. So people who are doing this might sit down, with their colleagues and say, I've been doing this coaching ourselves thing, and this is what we learned about strategy. It's not planning; it's something that emerges through learning, so maybe I'll try that topic too, and it spreads that way. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier on about leadership being, and management actually, not being a profession or a science, but being a practice. Is that nevertheless something that leaders and managers can A, feel proud of, and B, feel sufficiently proud of to want to become more competent and more accomplished at that practice?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think good managers, good leaders are constantly learning from their experience. That's why I didn't like these guys who put their hands up and say I'm a leader, because that's the beginning of narcissism, and we have much, much too much narcissism. Nobody should go around saying I'm a leader. People should go around saying I'm a learner.
Right. Is that? It prompts immediately the question, is that the essence of leadership and perhaps management? Actually, this willingness to learn, desire to learn, I guess.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say it's the essence of management. I would say it's a necessary component of management. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So necessary. Is there anything you would add to that to make it necessary and sufficient?
The learning, managing as learning. Well, I think, there's a learning mentality. Entrepreneurs are usually good at that, if they maintain it. So there's a learning mentality that keeps adjusting. Entrepreneurs are so in touch. Good entrepreneurs are so in touch with their business.
Yep.
They're constantly adjusting and adapting and so on. We've been up in the country. We moved to the country about an hour from Montreal at the beginning of the pandemic. We've been here ever since. We always dreamed of moving up here, but we used to come up on weekends, and we get a lot. We're well furnished by Amazon.
Yep.
And they are, we have at some occasions ordered things on Sunday and they're delivered on Monday. And this is a bit remote. I mean, it's an hour from town, but not
Yep.
in the city. And so Bezos must have been, and his team must have been amazing learners and working all this out. But now you
Mhm.
look at what Bezos is doing with this narcissistic trip to the moon and so on.
Mhm.
And the danger is you lose it. You think you're so wonderful that you can do anything. Well, he's taking money that wasn't taxed and on frivolous things. So it's unfortunate when you lose that. It's not only, it raises another issue. It's not only learning, it's also connecting to the consequences of what you do as a manager and leader. The Bezos, there's a consequence of what Bezos does.
Mhm.
On one hand, he sends out a message saying, here's a really sharp business activity that people can emulate in their own way. On the other hand, he's doing things that are just narcissistic and wasteful, and I just think
It,
it's awful.
is, is there and I hate to use this word, is it sort of an inevitability about all business leaders who arrive at that kind of stage, if you like, so that they become role models, inspirations, they become globally well known, and without looking at any individual, is there something about that status that creates that or in fact facilitates that attitude? Do you think?
It might. I mean, a lot of people fawn around you, so
Mm,
so obviously there are forces in that direction. But people fawn around Merkel, presumably for years and years,
yeah,
and it never got to her.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe women are better at that than men. I don't know, but there's a
Mm,
lot of women I think take it less seriously, but there are some women who take it much too seriously. But men are probably more inclined. But there are plenty of men. I mean, Biden has been in the center of power for an awfully long time. He seems to, he makes mistakes and all that, but he seems to maintain his level-headedness.
mm.
I can't say that about your prime minister in England at this point.
And
Um,
I couldn't possibly comment.
I can't imagine what level-headed means with Johnson, but anyway. So,
But,
so
I mean, does this mean, in a way, if we want good leaders and maybe good managers, that we need to be good followers in order to create the context and actually to push back if they become other than good leaders or managers?
Yeah, definitely. But also the good managers and leaders themselves are
Mm,
followers. Japanese, in Japan, they
yeah.
took leadership much less seriously. And
Mhm.
one of the guys teaching in our IMPM program used to say, used to talk about followership.
Right.
And there was a cartoon showing a duck with a bunch of little ducks running, and it said,
Yeah.
"There they go. I've got to follow them because I'm their leader."
Yeah.
Um, or a better, this is something much more telling for any leader, although it comes from a leader of government, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When an
Mhm.
activist, a black activist, asked him to support his cause, Roosevelt said, "Yeah, I'd like to support your cause. Go out and make me do it." And
Right. Uh,
that's a bit your followership. So you could say that the worker with the table in IKEA helped to make the chief executive, the entrepreneur, do it because he
mhm.
found it. So
Um,
that's another dimension of followership.
and that also says if leaders and managers should also be followers, there's an enormous, potentially enormous peer group influence on managers and leaders because they will be seeing role models and inspirations around them, and
Yeah,
which I guess is the same for almost everybody. Do you think that peer group input can be transformational for leaders and managers?
it can go both ways, can't it? Why are chief executives of businesses paid so obscenely? With two, three, 400 times as much as their workers. That's peer group pressure. Well, they're
Right.
all doing it. They're all getting paid obscenely, so why shouldn't I? And my answer to that is, oh, you mean you got to where you are because you follow everybody else, because you
Right.
imitate everybody else? That's what you're proud of.
Mhm.
But there can be peer group pressures to deal with climate change. There can be, why isn't your company keeping up with the changes we need in our, in our climate?
Absolutely. Now, I know, Henry, that your vision of of management, and we talked about this recently, is of the management being at the interface of art and craft and science. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, well, I make a triangle
Hmm.
and I put science here and I put craft here and I put art here. So science is really analysis, if you like, and craft is and evidence, and craft is experience, and art is insight.
Hmm.
And different managers tilt in different ways there. Part of my concern and part of my problem with MBA programs is it's so skewed to, if you take people in the class who aren't managers, you can't teach them the craft of management because craft is learned in apprenticeship.
Ah.
You can't teach anybody the art, they have it or they don't, and so they teach the science. They're inundated with analysis. Even the case study method is very analytical. You're supposed to go
Mhm.
through it and look at the numbers and come up with all
Mhm.
that. So there's too much management skewed in that lower left science
Mhm.
corner. A lot of great management is in the craft corner. It's about experience. It's about
Mhm.
learning from experience. It's about trying things. And a lot of the great management is art. It's creative. It's insight. It's vision. Um, and I also label those three corners: thinking first in science, uh,
Mhm.
seeing first in art, and doing first in science. And the example I use in decision making is choosing a spouse. Okay,
Mhm.
thinking first, you lay out all the criteria, you list all the possible spouses, you assess
Mhm.
them all, you come up with a score, and then you inform the lucky person that you chose them, except they've gone off and got married by the time you've done it.
Yeah.
Art is much more common, which is called love at first sight.
Mhm.
Very often we hire people in the space of an instant, we hire someone. We just know it's going to work. And same thing with marriage. My father met my mother and called his mother that day and said, "Today I met the woman I'm going to marry." It wasn't. There was no analysis in that.
Wow.
Um, and craft is doing first. You try it in order. This is the emergent strategy, and so you do something in order to learn, in order to do something more. In the case of spouses, I'll leave that to people's imagination what doing first is.
Uh,
Um, except for what somebody once said about the dangers of doing first, which is there are certain things like having a nuclear war or a baby where you can't say, let's try a little one and see how it works. So that's the negative
yeah.
side of emergent strategy.
That's very cleverly put. I'm just picking up from the comments a couple of questions that would be very interesting, actually, just to explore briefly, Henry, if we could. Jonathan White has mentioned that he agrees that experience and practice are key to being a good manager, and
Mhm.
also thinks that the educational underpinning in management and leadership is also useful.
Yeah.
That feels like it fits with that triangle.
Yeah.
I think is that right?
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, yeah, I think it's quite similar. Um, yeah, I mean, some of them, like education and practice, are all over the triangle. Experience is more craft. But yeah, I think it's consistent with it. Yeah, because I put practice, management as a practice, in the middle of the triangle and say
Yeah.
it's where the three of them come together. Uh,
And
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 it
education, I guess I talked about because MBA education is skewed lower left, and we try and skew our IMPM program more on the right. Some art, but at least encourage art, but a lot of craft.
and it also speaks to this idea of lifelong learning, I guess, really, because we can
Yeah,
get some experience, then some learning, and use that, and so on, and
yeah,
iterate it a bit like the emergent strategy effect.
absolutely.
And, the interesting question here that says, is the best learner in an organization likely to be loved, admired, suitably compensated? And I think that whilst it might not necessarily be about a leader, the best learner or somebody who is recognized as a learner in an organization has a personality in that organization. Do you think they're likely to be admired?
In healthy organizations, yes, maybe that's a measure of health. It's a
Right.
measure of the health of IKEA that this obscure worker idea that came from this obscure worker changed the whole company. So yeah, in a healthy organization, I think that's exactly what happens. We admire and respect people with ideas, people who learn, people come up with new stuff. And we recognize, and a good chief executive recognizes that it's not necessarily him or her.
Right.
And his or her idea, his or her job is to find those people and bring forward and create a culture that brings forward those ideas.
That's interesting. I'm thinking using that word culture there as a prompt for the next question, which is you mentioned to me earlier on rebalancing society. Then this is about culture beyond leadership, pure leadership and management. Can you tell us a little bit more about that idea, that principle?
Well, yeah, sure. In 1991, I visited Prague. That was 2 years after the Velvet Revolution, 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the conclusion in the West was that capitalism had triumphed. And it was clear to me, even then, that capitalism hadn't triumphed at all. Balance triumphed. The Eastern European countries, the communist countries, were out of balance, utterly out of balance on the side of the public sector. And the Western democracies were rather balanced at that time between public sector, government, private sector, business, and what I now call plural sector communities.
Yep.
The community force. That's a necessary third leg of any society. But because we thought that capitalism had triumphed, capitalism has been triumphing ever since, and we've been going out of balance on the other side. And the worst cases in the democratic world are the two great liberal democracies, the UK and the US, both of which are horribly out of balance on the side of private sector interests and rampant individualism, which has been getting in the way of their ability to deal with COVID. Too many individuals. In Canada, we're sort of a little better balanced, and we have much higher vaccination rates in this country. We have, we just, it's kind of natural. I think that's the case in Germany, the case in New Zealand, a number of countries. So Rebalancing Society, there's a website called rebalansingsociety.org, which lays it all out as to how we can get from here, this rampant imbalance, to some kind of balance and health. I'm just working on a piece, I mentioned it, called Climate Change is Not the Problem. Because it's a consequence of the problem, and the problem is imbalance. And until we rebalance society, we will get nowhere with climate change, period.
Right. Interesting. And that's one of the, I suppose, the foundations of that capability for societies to rebalance themselves would require us to collaborate at the leadership level and at other levels. And one of the questions in the comments is, can you speak to the challenge of collaboration in leadership, particularly cross-sectoral collaboration? And do you think collaboration is something that is, first of all, is easy to do, and secondly, is easy to train in leaders and managers?
I think it's a bit like I said before about training. It's more unlearning our individualism. If we recognize the price we pay for our rampant individualism, and I'm not opposed, I'm as much an individual as most people, but we have to balance. Balancing the three sectors is the same as saying we have to balance our individual needs, our collective needs, and our communal needs.
Right.
And if one of them is, and in the case of individual needs and private sector interests are so dominant, then you don't get there. Collaboration is the opposite of individualism. But economists have been preaching for decades, that somehow greed is good, and somehow benevolence is artificial. There's no such a thing as benevolence. When I hear an economist say that, I always want to say, what kind of mother did you have? I didn't have something like that. What kind of mother did you have? But collectivism, or not collectivism, that's associated with communism, but collective needs are
Mm,
absolutely critical to everything we do, and not least COVID. We would have
mm,
been nowhere with COVID without, we were prepared. Imagine, we were prepared to lock down our societies, to close down our economies. It would have been unimaginable. That's the message of COVID, that when you're threatened enough, you do
mm,
things that you would never dream of doing. And that's the message. It's got to be taken into climate change. when you realize when you realize the danger of climate change, you've got to do things. And we wouldn't even have to do anything as extreme as we did for COVID. We don't have to close down our economies to deal with climate change. We don't have to lock ourselves up to deal with climate change. We just got to get rid of the rampant lobbying. 300 fossil fuel lobbyists in Glasgow
mm,
a few days ago.
mm. Sure.
Wake
Well,
up. You've got to wake up.
I think, Henry, I mean, we've gone a little over time here. That what you've just said is the perfect exemplar of communityship, which I
Yeah.
think is where we actually started this conversation. And I think, I've taken a huge number of things out of this conversation. I think pick up on three things in particular, if I may. The first one is that idea of communityship, where leadership has become too much about individuals, and actually it's about our community outcome. We've also looked at this idea that actually you can't create a manager in a classroom. This needs to be partly learning by doing, and then learning a bit more, and then doing some more, and so on. And maybe actually, to pick up one of the points in our comments, one of our audience has made, maybe actually learning management is learning in action. And I think that's quite a nice way
Yeah,
to
that's right.
think about it,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
And then I guess the last one really is this idea of having a culture that allows, in like the IKEA example, that actually encourages and allows people to think differently, and then actually has a pathway that they can use in order to actually get some output from that different thinking. And I think if we could inculcate a culture like that in organizations, the curiosity that we want people to display would probably work out pretty good in leadership and management
Yeah.
terms, I think.
Just a final quick comment.
Mm.
When we realize that the obvious is outrageous, then we can start entertaining outrageous ideas that will turn out to be obvious.
Oh,
Uh,
very elegantly put, Henry, really, and a fabulous point at which to curtail our conversation, I think, really. This has been a superb discussion, and I'm really, really very privileged to have had this conversation with you, Henry. I'd just say to our audience, please, everybody, make sure you log on to our website at www.institutelm.com to reserve your place at any of our upcoming events. They're all free to access, and you can always continue the discussions, including this one, on our hub, which can be discovered from our website. It only remains now, I think, for me to thank once again our very special guest, Professor Henry Mintzberg, and to say I hope you all got as much from this conversation as I did. Henry, it's been a great privilege and a very great pleasure. Thank you very much
you're a great interviewer, John. Really delightful. Thank
It's
you.
good to talk to you, and thank you, and thank everybody for being with us. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.